Good people, welcome to the show. It's time that we start talking about Trae Young teaming up with some high-level talent in the NBA. I have some thoughts to share with you coming up on this episode right now.
I'm like, yeah, you see it?
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Josh, Kobe Bryant is the best scorer you've ever seen.
We can now rearrange history.
So I'm envisioning scenes on the way to the game.
I'm all for winning. I'm all for being competitive. But you took it to another level.
What's up, good people? Welcome to this episode of the Basketball Society podcast. Good to have you here. We're about to talk about Trae Young, and I have some thoughts about who I think Trae Young could and should look to team up with sometime in the next few years. I kind of have a wish list to share with you of different guys that I would love to see Trae Young play with at some point in the near future. So we're going to get to that on this episode. Good to have you here. If it's your first time watching or listening to the show, the Basketball Society podcast is on Apple Podcasts and it's right here on YouTube. If you're watching, subscribe to the YouTube channel. If this is where you watch or listen to your podcasts, all of the episodes, video and audio, are right here on the channel. But if you listen, then you can tap in on Apple Podcasts, and the show is available there as well.
If you're not a basketball purist, and if you're just looking at it for entertainment value, a lot of times Trae's style of play won't move the average eye. But to basketball people, for us to really see what he brings to the table, the excitement that he does without dunking the ball, is why a lot of people kind of don't give him the credit. And a lot has to do with him coming out of college, where a lot of these huge platforms said he wasn't going to be a good NBA player. So again, when these TV stations, they don't like to highlight what Trae is doing now because they were the ones that said he wouldn't be able to do it.
In case you need some reminding of who Trae Young is and what he's been doing and accomplishing, let me just give you some of the numbers and accolades just 6 years into the league at 25 years old. So Trae Young hasn't averaged less than 25 points a game since his rookie year, where he averaged 19 points a game. By the way, he averaged 30 his second year in the league, 30 and 9. He's the first player since Nate Archibald in 1973 to lead the NBA in both total points and assists. He did that in 2022. At 25 right now, he's fifth all-time in games with 30 points and 10 assists. He has 77 of those. He's the fastest player in NBA history to hit 400 threes. He's the fastest player in Atlanta Hawks history to reach 4,000 points in his career. He's the fastest player in terms of games played to reach 10,000 points, 3,500 assists, and 1,000 threes made in NBA history. He did that in 390 career games. And this season in December, he tied Oscar Robertson's record for most games in a row with at least 30 points and 10 assists. I just start to think about Trae Young, and I've talked about this on the show before when it comes to the younger NBA stars, right? Luka, SGA, Ja Morant, Devin Booker, Anthony Edwards, like these young stars that are coming up and starting to become some of the faces of the league and take over from the LeBrons and the KDs and the Stephs, while they're obviously still around and still elite. These young stars are coming up in their organizations and their situations. But I said this maybe about a year ago and maybe a little longer. This was pretty sure before Durant even went to Phoenix. So I was talking about this, and this was before Kyrie went to Dallas. But I was talking about Luka, Devin Booker, Ja Morant, Trae Young, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. Like, we have a lot of these great, really, really great young talents coming up in the league. And what's going to separate them essentially is what organizations they're a part of. SGA is in a great situation right now in Oklahoma City. De'Aaron Fox in a great situation right now in Sacramento. So when you look at, right, it's the same thing that we went through with some of the older stars, right, with carrying teams. It's why LeBron eventually went to Miami. He wanted to play with better players, right? It's why KD went to Golden State. These guys, they wanted to play with other high level players. And I know Durant's situation was totally different because he lost to them and everything. That's kind of its own thing. But the point is, we have started to kind of embrace the notion that great players should have an opportunity to play with other great players at some point, especially if they're in a situation like I feel Trae Young is in Atlanta, where he's kind of by himself as the only great player, the only elite level player. I thought DeJounte Murray was a great move, a great addition. I think they're a great backcourt, but to me, that team that they had a few years ago when they went to the Eastern Conference Finals, when they had Kevin Huerter, John Collins, like I thought they were onto something with that group, and I really liked Kevin Huerter next to Trae Young as a 3-point shooting threat. Like I thought Kevin Huerter could have kind of been the Klay Thompson to Trae Young's Steph Curry. Like I thought he had some of that potential, especially as a 3-point shooter. Now, DeJounte Murray's a really good player, 20-point per game scorer. He's been an all-star. Like he's a good player, but I'm talking about the likes of a little more elite level talents. And I have a little wish list here I want to share with you in a little bit of different guys that I think might make sense and that would fit and that I would love to see Trae Young get to play with. If we get that chance to see Trae Young play with some other elite level talent, we will really see what kind of havoc he can unleash on the league. And I have some examples of players that I think would be some great candidates for us to see Trae Young team up with sometime in the next few years. Now, he is signed with Atlanta through 2027. So for him to be teaming up with someone else or making a move, it would be him having to demand a trade sometime in the next few years. But if that doesn't happen, then to me, the rate that they're going by 2027, I'm sure we'll be talking about Trae Young free agency. Could he be leaving Atlanta for another destination? So I do have some thoughts and some ideas of what could make sense in terms of if Trae Young was thinking about specifically going somewhere to team up with someone in particular. Now, I think the best kind of players that would work with Trae Young, an elite level wing, shooting guard or wing player, or a versatile forward player, a hybrid post or a dual forward type of player. You know, the Lakers were brought up a lot. If Trae Young was playing with LeBron and AD, imagine how confident Lakers fans would be out here, LeBron fans would be out here that they could go for another ring. Like that's what I'm talking about. Like put Trae Young in that type of situation, and we're talking about danger zone. The first player I want to think about, the first player I want to introduce as a great teammate for Trae Young is someone that's already out there. He's given high praise to, and it's kind of been floating as a rumor that this could happen already. Wemby, Trae Young and Wemby would be like almost perfect. That's probably the best person on my list, the best person I could think of to pair Trae Young with. Trae is still young. He's 25 years old. That would probably be a scenario where he would have to be traded to San Antonio. So the Spurs would have to be hunting Trae to be like, yo, we want you here with Wemby as we go into this new era. I mean, I think that would be beautiful. Imagine the lob threats. I mean, if you watch Trae Young going downhill off pick and rolls, his lob threat game is elite. And imagine him having Wemby as a target. The versatility of Wemby and all the different things he can do at his size paired with Trae Young. I mean, that is the ultimate relief both for Wemby and Trae Young. I mean, you see what Wemby is doing now, essentially as the focal point with the Spurs. Pair him with a Trae Young who can take down entire teams and organizations in playoff series. Like he is a team killer. Look at we remember what he did to the Knicks in the Garden. Like he will single-handedly take you out. But you put him with another player like a Wemby and some of these other guys I'm going to talk about. That's where you're going to really see magic start to happen. So I think Trae Young and Wemby, anyone who thinks about that, it's hard to not think of how that would be like almost perfect and really dynamic. And it would be great for both of their careers, in my opinion. Next on my list is Anthony Edwards. So Minnesota is obviously, they've been a top seed in the Western Conference this season. They're playing well and they're starting to put together something there. I still have questions. I think a lot of us still have question marks, but they're still putting it together. And it's cool that they at least have bought into Anthony Edwards really being their best player. Kind of between him and Cat, but I think they're doing a pretty good job making it work. They're winning games, more games than they've won in a while. So things are looking good for Minnesota, but I think that we could still monitor that situation. Anthony Edwards is from Atlanta. That could play a factor maybe in Atlanta trying to lure him there to play with Trae Young. I don't know how that would really work best. I don't know if there's really an ideal scenario for either way in terms of Trae Young going to Minnesota or Anthony Edwards going to Atlanta. But I think you're looking at two scenarios where now Ant does have Cat, and I think Minnesota is making, I mean, I know they're making better strides over there much quicker than Atlanta has made with Trae Young. In terms of their draft picks, in terms of their trade moves, like Minnesota's been trying. They've been making moves and they've been at least evolving. And of course, Anthony Edwards kind of becoming what he's becoming now is a huge advantage for them in itself. But we could kind of monitor that situation in Minnesota to see, is that, because we know the Timberwolves don't have a great history of holding on to their superstars anyway. So over time, maybe in a few years' time, that could be something that Trae and Anthony Edwards talk about in terms of teaming up. Like that point guard, shooting guard combination, that would be a good start. You still got to round out the rest of the roster, of course. But man, to have a backcourt of Trae Young and Anthony Edwards, you could absolutely sign me up for that. I think that would make a lot of sense. And that would be, I mean, again, I'm looking at situations where both players could probably use each other based on where they are. Like, again, Anthony Edwards making much better progress with Minnesota right now in his situation, but we could still monitor that, and something could open up, and maybe that could become a possibility that could make sense for him and for Trae Young sometime in the near future. All right, my next one is Paolo, and I actually kind of love the idea of Orlando looking to make some kind of move or trade for Trae Young. I think they might have the assets. They certainly have cap space. From what I've seen, they're one of the top teams in cap space right now. They have guard assets. I think they would have the assets to at least present a trade, but to team up with, for the primary purpose of teaming up Trae Young with Paolo. Another dual forward. Paolo is still young, still only getting better. Right, he's having his best year this year for sure, and he just keeps evolving, keeps getting better. I think him as a forward, as a versatile forward who can score, who can do different things, pairing someone like him up with Trae Young, that's the kind of energy that I would love to see. Another up and coming young star in Paolo to play alongside with Trae Young. I think their two-man game would be really good. And I like the sound and idea of maybe Trae Young in Orlando specifically with Paolo and with that roster, because they have a lot of young assets. They have a lot of good things. To me, I really like what Orlando's been doing, and I think they could use more of an explosive lead guard, scoring guard like a Trae Young in that situation to pair with Paolo. Because I mean, again, the Eastern Conference is stacked. We know who the players are: Boston, Milwaukee. Philly's in there when Embiid is healthy. You still have Miami floating around, and the Knicks are very real and competitive right now. So these are all teams making the leap over teams like, they're above Orlando, Atlanta, Charlotte, right? Obviously Washington. But when you look at the potential for Orlando, I think bringing in, it would be a huge swing, but I think that would be a move to say, okay, now we can take them a little more seriously. So the pairing of Paolo and Trae Young, I think, would make sense for a lot of reasons. Another forward that I think would be really cool to see team up with Trae Young is Zion. New Orleans is kind of funky. I still can't really get a read on their potential. I love Brandon Ingram and Zion together. I love CJ McCollum there, and I think they have some decent things happening with their roster. But in terms of shaking things up, I think, again, not sure with this one what would be more ideal in terms of Trae going to New Orleans or Zion going to Atlanta. But in terms of shaking things up, which I already think Atlanta has to be trying something. I mean, trading Trae Young would imply that they're starting over and looking to rebuild. But they may have to look at doing that in the next couple of years if they can't get out of this cycle of mediocrity in the Eastern Conference. But New Orleans is kind of in a similar spot, right? Like they're just kind of funky. You don't consider them elite, but they have potential. So I think them looking to shake things up, bringing in a different kind of young lead explosive scoring guard like Trae Young to pair him with Zion. Again, that would open up lob threats. I think he would make the game a lot easier for someone like Zion. And playing and alongside Zion, obviously Zion is doing all that physical dirty work inside that kind of offsets what Trae does on the perimeter. So that would be a little different, but I think Trae Young and Zion together, I love that combination of Trae, everything he does on the perimeter, and Zion, everything he does from the free throw line below. Also, Zion is a really, really underrated playmaker. I've talked about that before. Really underrated playmaker. So that two-man game would be dynamic, not just from an explosive, like high-flying alley-oop standpoint, but even just from making plays. That would add so much to their passing game, operating out of a Trae Young and Zion two-man game. So I would love that as a potential team up for Trae Young to link up possibly with Zion. My last one is kind of a wild card here, and bear with me on this. This is kind of a little bit of a hot take, but I think this is another one that could make sense for a couple of reasons. Ja Morant. I think that obviously with the setbacks and stuff of the gun stuff and everything with Ja, and obviously he got hurt, so he's out for the rest of this year, and we kind of don't expect Memphis to do anything. But Memphis is another team I feel like maybe you guys need to shake things up. Trae and Ja obviously would be kind of a weird guard pairing. But I do think it could kind of like a new age version of a Russ and Harden. And they've been able to kind of make that work with the right like players like around them also in addition to them. But I think that balance of like your more perimeter oriented, skilled shooting off the bounce, making plays off the bounce in terms of shooting, floaters, more of the kind of like finesse scoring shooting game, deep threat game. The combination of that with Ja Morant's explosiveness at the rim and his ability to dominate scoring in the paint might make a lot of sense just basketball wise. Like again, you got 2 point guards. I get it, but I feel like that could make sense. Ja can play off the ball. He can be a cutter. Life can be a lot easier for him not having to handle the ball all the time and to be the lead guard. Trae Young is more of a 3-point threat, so you add gravity to the to an offense where you still have Ja Morant. Like, what if Memphis really looked at trying to bring in Trae Young, whatever that may look like, to team up Trae with Ja Morant? It could also inject some new life into Memphis. I just feel like between the suspension and then the injury with Ja Morant being out, I just feel like that organization has lost so much like momentum and life. And obviously when he comes back healthy, it will be exciting and that life will kind of come back. But I still think you've been looking at a roster. Like I love Desmond Bane. I love some of the other players they had. I love Jaren Jackson Jr. Like they've had young players growing and developing alongside each other. But I don't know. I just think between all the stuff with Ja, and not being able to really secure Memphis as like a contender, and with other teams developing and still getting better and still competing in the West, I just feel like you don't want to just rely on Ja coming back and being the sole savior of that franchise, even though Memphis has made more progress than Atlanta in their conference. Just feel like if they want to see a jolt of energy, maybe look at teaming up Ja with another elite level player, in this case, a guard, another point guard, where they can kind of work off each other and terrorize the league together. I mean, I think they can make that work. I would see that as like a new age kind of Russ and Harden, and maybe a little more explosive even because they're younger, and both of them are more in their prime.
There needs to be multiple faces of the NBA. And I think that's where we've gotten lost of appreciating players of different calibers. Now, both players are both point guards. They're both point guards. One is a more of a skill trait set point guard in Trae, and the other one is more of a high flying point guard in Ja. But to me, both players will win the MVP before their career is done. I believe both players will bring a championship to their franchises before they're done. And they're going to be a lot like, Isaiah, Magic, and Bird. Like, all three of those guys won championships for their franchises. And I think Trae Young and Ja Morant are both going down that line of bringing championships to their franchises.
People want to know who's going to be the next face of the league, who's going to take over. Anthony Edwards, SGA, like all of these great young talents coming up, but it won't be until one of them wins that we start to separate them from the others. Situation and fit and organization definitely matter. Like, where you get drafted definitely matters. And unfortunately for Trae Young, in my opinion, in Atlanta, I don't see anything going anywhere fast. And the only way out is to figure out who is going to be the ideal person for him to team up with. And to me, that's when we're going to see really the most meaningful basketball of Trae Young's career. He's done a great job of making Atlanta at least relevant, playoff competitive. They've won some series. They've been to the conference finals. But it's not until they're able to at least get him another elite level, star level player that we're going to see Trae Young really get to play up to his capabilities. And I would personally hate, as someone who loves his game and thinks the world of his potential just as a superstar talent, I think we are being shortchanged. We're not seeing really what the greatness of Trae Young on display. Not until we see him play with high level talent. I know it doesn't happen for everyone, and I'm not pitching for him to become part of the next super team, but the culture of teaming up is already happening. So I couldn't help but start to project early on, like, okay, out of these young stars, they're all great talents. Some of them are in better situations than others, but who's gonna look around after a few years and say, man, I'm tired of just getting bounced at the first round every year. I want to go play with that guy. I want to go team up over there. I want to see like what can we do here? Who's going to team up out of these young stars? I've been talking about it for a while. I think Trae Young is going to be a candidate for wanting to look around and ask around and say, hey, what might you want to do? Because I'm ready to start talking about winning now. Thanks for watching or listening to this episode. Let me know your thoughts on Trae Young down in the comments of this video, and subscribe to Basketball Society for more episodes of the show.